sometimes there's a willful ignorance on behalf of researchers who are trained and then just come back a few hours later and say, oh, actually, what did you say? I need help with my data management plan. So we also need to train peer reviewers if we are to peer review data. And there's a need also, again, to help people with data management plans. And there's still a lack of knowledge on how to make them. So we spoke about learned societies, and so I think the last point here would be a lack of driver like we had for open access. So some participants said that the ref was a real driver for open access, so maybe they would need a similar driver for open data. Okay, second point about the incentives for sharing and reusing data. So what incentives really and should we have? So we got a couple of examples of incentives. So Google Scholar, for instance, is starting to index data sets like publications. It's also, we could celebrate those who are sharing data. So we got examples of a prize for like open chemistry prize for students. Also another example is about visualization of how data are downloaded. So a colleague is creating some charts of like how many downloads for an article, and so that's really kind of giving, it's a very visual incentive somehow. And then it's really important to explain to researchers that data sets are as valuable as publications. There's a real lack of knowledge on how to cite data in articles. And so especially when it comes to data access statements, we can see that not that many funders require them. And so, yeah, it's quite a problem. So we think that publishers, funders, and institutions should ask researchers to have data access statements in all of their publications. Again, learned societies have a role here, so they could really celebrate researchers who share data, so with prizes again, that could be an example. And so we could also, universities could ask PhD students to share the data that they use to write their thesis. And that could be compulsory for the PhD to be awarded, so that's another idea. Here we are. Third point about the metrics. So how can we measure really the success of research data management and research data sharing? So there's an ambiguity, like researchers don't like to be measured, but they also like to be cited. So maybe we need to work on that ambiguity with them. They can see the benefits of DOIs, and they like having DOIs minted for their publications. So again, we could play on that. There should be, again, some clear recommendation on how to cite data. That seems really important. We talked about difference within disciplines, so subject-specific metrics. So we can't ask everyone to share data, and we need to find the limits about like, should we ask anyone to share data or not, and like who's in charge of these limits. So I think we spoke about that in the morning already. So open science is not always appropriate, can't be appropriate for everyone. And there's a big problem about interdisciplinary projects. What do we do when you have a project which with researchers in humanities and in engineering, for instance? How can we have metrics for them? Do they all have to share data or not, etc. Fourth point. So really we spoke more about subject-specific concerns on open science. So what's the role of institutions? So someone said that usually researchers are more concerned about what their own discipline, their own research community is saying than what their institution is saying. So should there be some guidelines, so written by learned societies or in each discipline? That's a question. Someone else said that, gave an example that in his conference presentations, he's like giving the presentation and showing the data at the same time. So that could be an example. Maybe it doesn't work for all disciplines, but that seems to be a nice example. So we so that was in chemistry. Someone else said that in psychology, there's a big habit of sharing data. And someone else spoke about acoustic studies, where also researchers are really used to sharing data. So that's maybe interesting to look at, find different disciplines that have this habit, and then go and ask, like, how come and what's the history behind that, maybe. 2 minutes. Sorry? 2 minutes, okay. So we spoke again about the role of funders. Should they push to get back the money that they have invested in the project? And if yes, so we have the example of ESRC, which has created their own repository, UK Data Archive. So that could be an example where in each discipline we could have funders pushing for sharing data while giving infrastructure for that. We also spoke about subject-specific habits, but also within each department. Sometimes colleagues have seen that in one university, it really depends on the department, on the culture in the department. So that seems to depend on what's the policy in the department, what's the type of relationship with the library, etc. So that was also very interesting. Fifth point, the costs. And so how to charge to pay for research data management services in institutions. So who should be in charge of that? Should it come from each grant? So should the money, a little bit of money should be taken from each grant? And then how do you charge it, per gigabytes or per number of grants? So it's a little bit difficult to define. And again, like in very practical terms, how do you get the money from the PI before he or she uses it? So that's still a question. Someone said that it's still too early to really have a real costing model, because like there are lots of pilot projects, but it's really too early to say which one works or doesn't. So there's, at the moment, there's a GISC pilot project for shared data management services, but again, we don't know what the outcomes will be of that. So that, again, that's maybe very early. So should funders be in charge of providing research data management services? Someone was saying that that's what they thought would happen 10 years ago, and then it didn't. So there's a need for somewhere a concentration of expertise, so that support staff can really rely on that expertise to just advocate and train researchers, and especially to answer day-to-day inquiries, which seems to be one of the main difficulties. And last point, data scientists, what should be their skills? So we got a couple of ideas. So anonymization seems to be a very tricky issue in some universities. So data scientists should be expert in that, or help out at least with that, because anonymization is a condition of sharing data in many disciplines. That's actually a very key point. Basic IT skills, so data scientists should share these IT skills with every researchers, but starting with undergraduate students, really. So the idea was really to start as early as possible, so data scientists would be in charge of that training. And someone mentioned that short workshops are very efficient. So they gave example of data carpentry workshops or software carpentry workshops. They seem to be very efficient to train both students and senior researchers. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. In the interest of time, we'll move straight on to the next group. So group 2, I think, is Wato Chelia, and the rapporteur is Paolo.
So thank you very much. So these are the results of group 2. I'd like to share it with you in 3 parts. First part, just a brief resume of what has been said. So we talked about what kind of data should be produced and who should give advice. on producing this data and in order to have the best way for preserve them and for sharing them and reuse them. Then we talked about libraries, services and IT services. We talked about existing policies and the universities that were attending this group. I'd like to say that the whole group, with one exception, has a national character. It means that the resume it's addressed to mainly to British institutions. So we had just one colleague from the continent here. Then we discussed about research data management plans and research data management policies, and about the definitions of data, and about the confusion existing in this kind of definitions. So terminology, questions, topics, issues, and then we passed to talk about responsibilities and roles of individuals, institutions, funders, and then about data management plans, and who are the drivers behind all processes in the research life cycle. Then we passed on to talk on about legal issues and on how to comply with the requirements concerning legal and ethical issues. At the end, we talked about the kind of profiles needed, for example, in the human research, in the human resource development. And we talked about cost models and about basic services that should be offered. One remark, although we asked about the profiles, the word data scientist was never used, which is also a result. So the results of this working group, voters and me, we tried to assign a value to the results. So we have decided to divide the research life cycle in 5 sectors. One sector is the production of data, the second one is the ingest of data, the third one is the management, archiving of data, then the reuse of data, and then we have a transversal horizontal segment which is covering all these fields. So concerning the question of what kind of data should be preserved and who should give advice, we got the answer that IT services and libraries are doing this work, and that policies and guidelines are required more than they are now. So we need more policies, more efforts in policies, more efforts in guidelines that are translated into short documents, and these short documents should be exposed to stakeholders with explaining the guiding principles of these short documents. Exposed to stakeholders, it means that the stakeholders should be identified. The stakeholders in all these 4 segments and the transversal horizontal segments. Concerning the data, there is a need for terminology work. What is open, for example? What's the definition for open? To whom should be addressed this message of openness? Concerning the costs, once we have defined the stakeholders, and once we have defined the whole segments of the entire life cycle, then it's easier to define the profiles needed that should be defined, that should be assigned to their roles. In this way, it's easier to define the costs, because the costs are not only the terabytes or the gigabytes or what kind of bytes, but also the services behind it. And in this work of definition, we have to identify the drivers behind the production of data and the services that we need. So we identified external drivers like funders or internal drivers. Internal drivers, institutional drivers are, for example, visibility or reputation needs, but not only. We talked about awareness. We need mechanism of raising in order to raise the level of awareness, and this mechanism should address the researchers and the institutions. Concerning the human resources development, we need a better definition of profiles. So, for example, in order to provide the scientists and the structure with the training courses of scientific integrity, or the creation of central points of contact. Now, to the results. The results are, we need guiding principles with short documents for training, dissemination, for the central points of contact. We need cost models. We need model of basic services. And we have to do some terminology work with definitions. Then the definition of stakeholders and actors along the whole life cycle is needed in order to better define costs. Then the last question is the legal services. We talked about legal services and services inherent to the legal and ethical services. And these elements are better definition of use of licenses. We need to talk about agreements. Agreements, for example, for sharing data. We need, for this agreement, legal advice. We need also consulting concerning the ownership and future ownership of data. And at the end, we have to improve the dialogue with the funders. So thanks.
Okay. Could we have group 3 on the stage, please? So our rapporteurs are Barbara and Raman.
Yes. Good afternoon from our side. And we like to summarize the outcome of the group 3. And we focused in the beginning of our discussion very much on the incentives and how we can get incentive of the data management, data sharing, and all this stuff. One of these things is what we see is to bring also incentives in sharing, and this is also in the kind of the visibility of the researchers, visibility of the data sets, and also to give a lot of value to the data sets. Not only the values to the publications, also more values to the data itself. And so the importance of citation, of data citation, this is what we have seen. It's very important. And for these, our discussion drive to the way that the data management should be not an additional part of the research. It should be more included. It should be in the way of how it's doing the research, not just an additional thing what the researchers then also have to do. And it's more that's something what happened in the research field as well. So for these, then we have a lot of discussion about different disciplines, and there are some disciplines out there. They have a big tradition of data sharing, and there are some disciplines they are just beginning of sharing the data and doing this. And we have also to look at the different disciplines and to talk to the researchers and to see how the researchers do their work, and from which history came this research field, these research disciplines, and how we can implement these into the different fields and into the different disciplines, the sense of data sharing and the sense of data management. Then the next big topic what we also discussed is, of course, the costs. And we've seen the costs it's very complex. So even when you want to make a forecast of what will be the data, the halving of the data for the next 20 years, for the next 30 years, and so on. So it's also it's not predictable how much will it cost in the next years. So we came to the conclusion it's better to see it in a not that long period, so we can estimate a little bit of what will be cost of the next 3 years. And also we've seen and we've discussed that same thing that in group 2, that the cost is not only the hardware. So the hardware is what we are, a lot of people, what we have seen is the cost of hardware is going down. But the main drivers are the services and the people who are running the services. So running the infrastructure and the data management should be a very sustainable thing. From this point of view, we have also discussed a little bit in the way of, should it be national-wide, should it be disciplinary repository, should it be institutional repositories? And also in this way, in this kind, we've talked, it's depend a little bit on the discipline. And also one very interesting point was that focus on the institutional way. It's the institutions are more stable than you have when you than you build now new institutions for data management, data centers, and so on. When you based on the institutional level, it would be also nice, and it also brings some visibility and some incentives also for the institutional.
Okay, Raman, you mentioned nearly everything. I would just add something to this parallel existence of different archive systems. We discussed should every institution implement its own repository, and there are pros and cons for that, because on the one hand there is the cost factor, on the other hand there is the important topic of ownership of data. We also talked about different roles. There is the role of the funder who wants to have open data. But what about the institutions? To what extent do they feel free to make their own judgments? They should also have an impact in shaping the policies. And then, of course, there is the role of the researcher. So what do the researchers actually want to do with their data? How far would they want to, do they want to open it? To whom? To what time extent? So there needs to be a dialogue between all these stakeholders. I think that was it. Raman will tell you about the conclusion.
And also the conclusion were also in two ways, that we should challenge the whole evaluation system. So it should also be more focused on the data and not on the publications. And the second conclusion is to bring the positive message of data management and data sharing into the institutions.
Okay, thank you very much. So we move to our final group, and I think the rapporteurs for group 4 are Gema and Imola, is that right? Yes? I hope so. Good.
You could be me. Going to be me. Okay.
It's you. Very good.
1 second. Okay. So, well, we didn't cover all the topics, just 3 and last one, mainly about the incentives, training, engagement, and then a little bit about costs. And regarding incentives, some key elements that could be were highlighted were the mandates, both the publishers, also in the case of PLOS, for example, or funder mandates, but just if they recognize the research and data management like something required, that is required, but also is funded. There is a need to take a different approach depending on the disciplines, that is clear, and it is not that easy to distinguish between science, pure sciences, and social sciences and others, because
there are many, many differences. One point was to show the risk of the problems, the potential problems of losing your data, and that could be an incentive for researchers to engage on data management. Also, the training could be considered an incentive. And they consider also the participants were thinking about the fact that there could be a shift with the new generation of researchers. So it is good to take on early career researchers, and they are more receptive to research data management activities, so they could be a change soon. Also, it is very important to acknowledge and recognize the work of researchers, so the research data management should be somehow evaluated or recognized, but it is difficult to measure. One indicator could be the reuse of the data set, so it is needed to give all metrics to the researchers. Who is using my data set? How many times is downloaded? Because an important thing for the researcher is to have a position, a reputation, visibility in their communities. So having these indicators could be an incentive. And also related to something that I said before, funder mandates, but also granting time and money for this task. There was also a little bit talk about the responsibilities and the limits between the data journals and repositories. That could be confusion, that could be complicated. So regarding training, the general barriers were that researchers don't want a generic training that could be for everyone, so they want disciplinary specific training for their specific needs. But the main problem is that there is a lack of awareness. It is not recognized as a problem. What is that for? I don't need that research data management, so I don't need any training about that. And also because there is some, in some disciplines, we mentioned the humanities and some specific humanities domains, that they don't think they are using data as itself, or the methods or how they work are different. So for example, they don't consider that the data support any evidence of the research, so it's a complete different approach. So first, there is a barrier of terminology, how we can approach these different disciplines. And so, because if they don't see they are using data, they don't see it to be reusable or reproducible. That's reproducibility is just for some disciplines. So different approaches that could be applied could be first address these different discipline concerns and how are their methods, their data characteristics, and so on. Include RDM in PhD programs. That is not always easy to embed in these existing programs, but also to senior researchers or any other researchers, but not just RDM courses, but include RDM in methods training courses. And one good idea that is also working in other areas is to ask early adopters to as catalysts and champion for data management, showing the benefits, telling the benefits they have experienced when doing RDM. And finally, the last little thing about cost, because we were running out of time. We just had one use case that had made some cost analysis regarding RDM, and I think it was quite high, like 160,000 pounds a year, with a big quantity, maybe I'm wrong, you can correct me, a big amount per project. And to make this cost analysis, they took into account a lot of things, including, of course, the workflow of ingestion, curation, and so on, the personal cost, but also these costs that right now are needed, like advocacy, training, promotion, and so on. So and the last thing regarding cost or related to cost is that it is important to make funders aware of RDM costs and integrate this in the funding models. That's it. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. So thank you all for your. I'm sorry, I don't think this is on. Thank you all for your contributions to the workshops. We've heard the brief summaries from each of the 4 groups. These will be written up in formal reports by the rapporteurs after the session. We'll be putting them on the Learn website and then notifying you by email and asking you to comment or maybe give more details into some of the areas if you're willing to share them with us so that we could work up some of the case studies in particular as best practice case studies for the roadmap.